This is California Convictions. My name is Aaron Channel, and I'm going to be speaking today about some of the experiences that I had while I was incarcerated in California's Department of Corrections. God, for almost 17 years, it wasn't quite 17. They sentenced me to 17 and a half, but good behavior and all that. It was my associate's degree. That got me out a couple months early. Today, I'm going to be speaking primarily about the idea that a man's only as good as his word there in prison. I realize that it's a little bit cliched and it's one of those tautologies like a man's got to do what a man's got to do or you are who you are. But it is true that your word and the degree to which people know that you're consistent and you can be trusted, it determines who you are in prison and the value that you'll be ascribed in any situation. Part of this is just because of the intrinsic communal nature of a prison. I mean, everybody has to be up in everybody's business. A little bit on the SNY sides. That's more like the Wild Wild West. SNY is PC. But they're on the GP yards, the active yards. Yeah, everybody is up in everybody's business. And it's just because you're always assessing the guy next to you. What is he going to do if something drastic and awful happens? This is an environment in which people are murdered for no good reason. No reason that makes sense to me, and I hope no reason that makes sense to anybody watching. I understand reality is what it is, and some of the people who died in prison, I just imagine they were looking for it. I don't know how else to describe it. They were fighting their whole lives looking for the guy that was going to end theirs. They're gladiators, warriors, soldiers. Yeah, but it's still a tragedy whenever anybody loses their life in that environment. And you're always assessing the guy next to you. This is an environment where people die. Might not be that yard you're on, might not be that cell you're in. Maybe you're around a bunch of old timers that are real relaxed, but well, blood has been spilt on that concrete, and I realize it's a little aggrandizing, but yeah, it's a scary place. So, people are always assessing each other. And I recall a dude whenever I was at High Desert, there on B Yard. He was a little bit of a JCat. I'm not sure how he would have been described, and he purported to believe the same thing that the tough Aryan gang member guys believed. It's just that he seemed to really believe it in kind of a fervent religious dogma type of way. And he was incarcerated for firebombing a synagogue and for murdering a pair of homosexual gentlemen, as I recall. Myth. Myth was the dude's name. And it was strange that he wasn't just immediately, yeah, that's the dude that, he burned down a synagogue and him and his brother killed a couple of insert awful expletive for homosexuals because there was a lot of racism and hate of every variety in this environment. Of course, Myth had his own. He insisted you could use any word you wanted. I preferred homosexual, or if I had to, gay, I suppose, is the acceptable nomenclature amongst inmates if you're being polite. But he preferred sodomite. He would correct people on that word. If you used any other word, he would say, oh, you mean the sodomites. And he'd killed 2 of them, so he had an opinion. Well, Myth, his word wasn't worth a heck of a lot, and I don't know how else to describe it, where I don't think that anybody would have planned on him standing shoulder to shoulder to them if things got nasty. And he seemed erratic in his everyday behavior in some ways. There was an occasion on which some meth hit the yard. And he came by. What did he sell? He sold a little radio and a big collection of porn and 1 or 2 other knickknacks to Scooby. Scooby's a decent guy. Whenever Myth came back a week or 2 later, hey, can I get that stuff back? Because I gave you a really good deal. It's worth like $30, and I only charged you $8 for it because I needed $8 right then. Scooby didn't even, blink. He went, absolutely, here you go. Slid it back out the door and gave him back his $8 that he'd, went and gotten back because he realized that he'd made a mistake. It was just an occasion that demonstrated that this dude lacked the conviction of his convictions. He claimed to, my God, he murdered men. And because he's some soldier in God's army, as he expressed it. But he lacked the fortitude, discipline to comport himself in everyday life like some other dudes who, they weren't crazy, and they still believed some wrong-headed and some foolish things that I will speak about with contempt on any occasion they come up. All the racism, the hate, the gangs. But they at least seemed like honorable, decent men. If one of them dudes had said to me, hey, I'm going to stand right here with you and we're going to live together or die together because it's that day, well, I believe they would have stood right there with me, and as nasty as it got, they would have been standing. I can respect the heck out of that mentality, even if anytime it comes up, have to go, but I don't understand how you get there. I don't understand that environment, and I'm sure some of the other guys do. I had somebody mention recently that I'm not one of the cell warriors that's touting how tough they were, and I don't mean to either way. I'm not saying I wasn't tough or I was. It's just not something to talk about, but I don't get the reason so many of the guys were tough. It's a posturing, I suppose, and it probably comes down to gangs and money. I was there. I'm an expert as far as it goes, and I don't have a clue what the logic was. I'm rambling a little bit, but the point is that Myth, in spite of the fact that he purported the same beliefs, the same convictions of the guys around him, he wasn't liked, and he was held in a little bit of contempt by a lot of guys, and it was a quiet contempt. I don't mean anybody ever called him a nasty name. I think people just looked past him, turned their nose up at him. Similarly, my name was okay. I had a good name, but I wasn't active. I was not sleeved back. There wasn't a real gang because, I was a Peckerwood. And a Peckerwood just means that you're white and you're in the prison is what it means. There's no initiation. They don't tell you, okay, ride or die, brother. It's just that you fit in with the crowd to the point that you can go, hey, I'm just a Peckerwood. I'm not really trying to work my way up the ranks and join one of the real gangs. The real gangs had their own structure and their own mentality, and I was never a part of it, and I suppose plenty of guys turned their nose up at me as well, and that's okay. I wasn't there to fit in. I was there to get by as well as I could, and they let me. And that's as much as I reasonably could have asked for, and it's what I was given. There was no point where somebody pushed up on me and told me that I had to fill in the blank. Which isn't to say that I went around making a nuisance of myself. I made it a point to always be an asset to whoever the heck I was around. And it's good advice in general. If the people around you look at you and they know that you're no good, your words no good, your character's no good, well, they'll write you off to some degree, and whenever they're deciding who they dislike for other reasons, perhaps one of three people did something unfortunate. Somebody stole something out of an area, and we know it's one of you three. Well, the fact that you're inconstant, that your yes does not mean yes and your no does not mean no, even upon occasion, it detracts from your credibility in an environment where you're around a bunch of sneak thieves, liars, and killers. The last thing that you want to be perceived as is a sneak thief or a liar. If killer is option number 3, then that's probably preferable any day of the week. It makes me think of a gentleman that I knew whose word was good. And I mean, he was known as his word had been good for the past 30 or 40 years. He'd been doing time, and he was known a little bit before that. Maybe it was 20 or 30 years. I was a youngster, so I could be exaggerating his age. But he was an old timer, and he had a lot of respect. I've mentioned him before. His name was Wolf. And I don't mean respect as in there's some huge deference. It wasn't like the dope hits the yard and they cut him off a big piece and give it to him and say, "Here you go, brother. We love you. We love you even though you're not active anymore." It's just that it was known that he'd handle his business if he had to, and he had in the past in at least one form or another, and that does garner you a type of respect in prison. He's a decent guy. I believe he had been involved in some of the gang stuff, but I never asked, and he never went into any depth in it, and being as how he'd been doing his time in the 80s and 90s, rather than the early aughts, whenever I started my time and things were a little bit more relaxed, there were fewer live rounds fired on the yard, there were fewer knives, things like that. Well, it varies from where you are, but I think most people agree the 80s and 90s were a rough time. Especially up at High Desert. That's a scary place to have been back then. Because he'd been through this, I never asked him any questions, and he never answered, but it was apparent that he'd done his. Well, Wolf's word was gold. I remember on one occasion it reaching the point, hey, Shadow Pit, incidentally, I didn't shout out back like I like to, and thank you for commenting on the volume, Shaliste Girl. Wolf's word was gold, and I recall at one point I'm pretty sure he was going to go get the guy, and, he talked himself down. You saw him not wanting to be the guy who was willing to stab somebody over $20. And I suppose it had been a character development, because I believe he had been known as the guy who might do that. I like to think that in, the 20 years since I knew him, that he's went further along that route, and that now he's actually a pretty, he's a pacifist insofar as you can be in that environment. And that's a funny question. To what degree can you be a pacifist in prison? There is that same thing we're talking about. To what degree is a man evaluated by his word? If you just announce out there on the prison yard, I'm a pacifist and I'm not going to participate in any of this violence, you're likely to end up with some real pushback. There was a Christian gentleman with whom I was acquainted, and one of the harder things that I did while I was locked up is something that may sound irrelatable, but I kept my mouth shut while this dude was getting chewed out in a real nasty way by a skinhead about how you can't use a paper shield, a Bible, and expect the people around you not to push up on you and tell you that the only reason you're safe is because they're standing between you and the knives, that he's a soldier and you're, well, you can imagine the 2-minute hate-filled diatribe that somebody could concoct if they put their time into it and planned on getting in the face of somebody. Dude stood and took it, and I don't mean he stood and took it like he was angry and he wanted to punch the guy, and I don't mean he stood and took it like, he cowered, and he just accepted, best as I could tell, that was part of what prison was for him. That rather than doing the push-ups and running up on somebody, he was going to get yelled at. And I like to believe that his faith made that a light load to bear, that was an easy chewing out, or whatever you want to call it, whenever somebody threatens you a little bit and calls you nasty names and bullies you really bad. I like to think that load was lighter because of his faith, and I couldn't tell you, I don't recall ever speaking to him about it again. But that guy who says, no, I'll accept whatever abuse might come that way, and I never did that. That is a ballsy thing to stand up and yell that. To what degree do you imagine his word is as good as on that? There was a Zen parable that I liked to think of whenever I was incarcerated, wherein there was a Ronin who was going from temple to temple, just butchering people during some conflict or another in feudal Japan. And that he would go into the temple and gut people and watch them die. Oh goodness, a graphic violence warning in this one. I'm sorry for anybody that might trigger. Gut them and watched them die, and whenever he approached one monk, the monk didn't blink. And the guy raised his sword and came at him, and the monk didn't blink. And the guy said, "Are you a fool? Aren't you going to run? Don't you understand that I will cut you in half, and I won't think about it twice?" And the monk just stood there, and he said, "Yes, but I will let you cut me in half. You can cut me in half, and I won't think about it twice either." I'm, of course, butchering some of the paraphrasing, and that's fine because it's been translated probably 3 times before I read it anyway. But I admired that level of conviction, whether it was in a soldier doing his push-ups, ready to stand the line with that piece that he kept inside of himself while he did those push-ups. This is a real thing in prison, that gangster pouch, and that's admirable, if nothing else, that you're willing to endure that discomfort and do 100 burpees out there on the yard. I mean, Jesus Christ. Similarly, the man who was, and it was called hiding behind a paper shield or a paper book or something, whenever you had your Bible, and that was, "No, I won't participate." And there were some guys that stood that line, and that is another incredible degree of discipline. And finally, just somebody who happens to have been able to not participate. I was lucky as much as anything else that I wasn't involved in anything serious. I saw one decent riot that I described in a video, and there were a couple of times that, maybe it will happen, but no, I never had to choose what I was going to do whenever the guy came at me with a piece. And I had no intent of being a pacifist. That I hope I never sold that I was just going to stand there and let somebody hurt me. I think that I was honest about where I stood, that I didn't want to hurt anybody and hope nobody ever had to hurt me, but I'd defend myself as best as I could. And I think that's where most guys in prison are at the end of the day. Am I going to do a video about Christianity in prison? It's an interesting question, and honestly, I'd like to do a short video on experiences that I had with most of the major faiths and what my perception and understanding was of being that faith while incarcerated. It is just such a difficult topic to speak on with any authority, and especially to do in a manner that is tasteful and respectful to the individuals and faiths involved. It would be a long-term project, but absolutely, I'd love to speak on that subject because it's something that I gave an incredible amount of thought and work into. One thing that inmates you do it if you're smart, is collect any type of certificate that you can. Any piece of paper, a letter, or anything from an outside organization, if you're a lifer, that says you did something. If you can get a certificate saying you took anger management, great. And a lot of places that offer this, it's going to be through a religious perspective. There will be a Christian group, or heck, even a Scientologist group, or a Muslim group, or a Jewish group, whatever group it might be, that offers a course that is 10% anger management and 90% their particular religion. There are others which will have the other fraction. It's 99% anger management or drug rehabilitation and 1% their faith. And I don't think that they would disagree that that 1% will permeate everything that they produce. If they're an organization of faith, if the Catholic Church tries to put together a non-denominational anger management program, but it's put together by the Catholic Church, it's still 1% and a work of faith. There was a famous lawsuit, actually, where a lifer was denied parole because he had refused to participate in NAAA. That's Narcotics Anonymous and Alcoholics Anonymous. Pardon my stutter. He had refused to participate for years and years, and the board came down and said, well, you're not going home because you didn't participate. And he appealed it and won based on the logic that this was a faith-based organization. Step 1, admit there is a higher power. And he said, well, I'm an atheist. This is religious discrimination. It's quite possible that he was manipulating the law a little bit or trying to push on a scale to get himself a second bite of the apple to get back to board. I don't doubt that many lifers have used this argument in bad faith, which is to say that they're not actually atheists and they don't care one way or the other about religion. It's just that the process of going to NAAA was a hardship and they didn't, and now they're using this as an argument to abnegate their personal responsibility for having not gone. But it did stand. The court said, you know what, this is valid, and from now on, this is not a reason to deny inmates at board, is that they didn't go to NAA. That's okay. But you do have to have participated in some alcohol management or narcotics management or addiction therapy program. They require sex addiction therapy in some cases for sex offenders. Probably not enough, and I don't know to what degree anything like that works at all. I don't have statistics, but it is required the same way that it is for drug addicts or whatever, but it's no longer faith-based organizations as their primary stance. Another gentleman who I was pretty good with was Derek, and he had a good word is the best way that I can describe him, that I knew if he said, you know, it's raining outside, but I'm going to be out there and I'll be out there if it's pouring. Well, he meant it. He was across the tier at High Desert, and he was out there every day doing burpees. He lived in the upper tier. Anyway, on one occasion, I saw somebody else ask him, well, you know, what are you doing all the burpees for? Do you really think that you're going to make a difference in combat? Or something like that, because he was a little older. And it was a very disparaging kind of question. And boy, Derek was as polite as he could be about it. He explained, well, you know, if something does happen, I just want to be going for that extra 12 minutes while things are terrible, and you stand behind me if you have to. It's just another example of somebody being bigger than they had to within the environment. Well, I've enjoyed speaking on these subjects, and I didn't intend to go for longer than a half hour. But if anybody had a specific topic, subject, anything like it, you go ahead and shout it out in the comments, and I'm literally happy to extemporize on anything. I'd finally like to thank my wife for she put together the thumbnail for this video. I just said, hey, how about a thumbnail for this video? And she did it immediately, and she consistently does, I mean, half of the work on this channel easily. I say a couple of times, and it's not entirely untrue that if she weren't standing behind me doing all of the legwork and the technical stuff, I'd just put a light up and be talking to a blank wall because I have no idea how I would have set any of this up. Thank you very much for listening this evening, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up and say good evening. And oh my goodness.